Welcome to the Sexual Harassment Prevention Training Program. This training has been specifically prepared for the Diocese of Churches for the Sake of Others and its congregations. In the next hour, we will be addressing the prevention of sexual harassment, as well as various other kinds of harassment, such as bullying behavior. Sexual harassment in the workplace is a complex topic that raises difficult issues. But this training will provide some practical solutions that will help your church provide a workplace that improves interpersonal relations by giving a perspective that helps build respect for others, identifies workplace interactions that give rise to harassment, and builds habits of caring for others. Surveys have indicated that sexual harassment has been a significant issue even at churches. Happily, because churches seek to set an example for a dark world by being shining lights of respect and love for others, we have high hopes that this is an issue that can be addressed effectively by creating a healthy workplace environment in the church. My name is Kelly Marsh, and I'm an attorney from Church Law Center of California. And while this is a training program required by law in many states, we caution you that we're not offering specific legal advice. If questions come up in the diocese regarding an instance of harassment, please refer to the appropriate reporting representative at your local congregation or to the ombudsman at the diocese. We'd also like to briefly share our experience as a law firm working with many church clients. We think that it's fair to say that with every large client, like a denomination that we've served, that each has unfortunately experienced issues where there have been allegations of sexual harassment at various times. That being said, many of the instances we've dealt with in churches are not ones that would give rise to level of criminal behavior. Rather, they're often ones where in the moment, people don't realize that they're engaging in offensive conduct, and they don't understand the nature of the things they're saying or doing are making others uncomfortable. We're hopeful that an effective training program will be helpful in getting people to think about their own behaviors that they may or may not have given much thought to before. And Myron will share some examples of this later in the training. As we review these materials, we hope that they will help everyone consider their own behaviors and additionally help you to have courage and knowledge to correct these types of behaviors in others if you see them happening.
I am Myron Steves, also an attorney at the Church Law Center of California. It's our great privilege to be able to provide legal services to the Diocese of Churches for the Sake of Others, as well as many of the individual congregations within the diocese. Our program today will address sexual harassment prevention in a manner that advances 4 philosophical commitments that are a part of a godly perspective on workplace conflict held by the Diocese of Churches for the Sake of Others. First, God is our highest authority. Second, our standards are higher than the world's standards. Third, others should be treated as made in the image of God. Fourth, the workplace and ministry should be free from harassment. As Christians, we submit ourselves to those whom God has placed in authority over us, while still knowing that He is our ultimate authority. We must always choose actions, especially in challenging circumstances, that will honor and glorify Him. The training is mandated at a state level in at least 7 states in 2021 when we're recording this talk. Each state has different expectations of what should be covered for employees in those states. Our plan here is to meet the standards of all the states where C4SO has congregations. So, we will be covering a lot of material. Because the topics to be discussed have been prepared by state legislatures and civil rights departments within other states and not churches themselves, we will get into details addressing standards that have been set by secular law rather than by the church. Happily, we have a more firm foundation upon which to base our standards for good character than most states provide. Even so, some of the expectations of secular law can be surprising. So please bear with us and consider how these things that may seem very basic for us as Christians may come across as new concepts for those in a secular workplace, which is what state governments were primarily thinking of when they approved these laws and regulations. Additionally, some states consider sexual harassment by vendors and volunteers to be wrongful acts committed by employers if they take place at the local workplace. So, even if your staff is well trained and treats all employees and guests with respect, if a vendor is harassing an employee, the church could be held legally accountable. The fact that some states consider employers to be liable for vendors who harass their employees comes as a surprise to a lot of people. This is because the regulations require that employers protect their employees generally from harassment and don't distinguish who primarily caused the harassment. Perhaps the most typical example of vendor harassment would be a third-party company that provides services at the church workplace repeatedly or over a long period of time. Examples of this would be a delivery service for packages or bottled water, or construction workers during a remodel which involves work by the vendor who is on site every day of the week for several weeks. While it's unlikely that an employer would be held liable for vendor offenses that the employer knew nothing about, the employer could be held liable if it knew that vendors were creating a hostile environment or harassing individuals at the church and did nothing to protect its employees. This illustrates the fact that employers under these regulations are responsible for maintaining a safe workplace, not just training its employees. As followers of Jesus Christ, we believe that everyone is created in the image of God and should be treated with the utmost respect and care. As we start this training, let's recall Jesus' words from Matthew 25 when he explained the difference between those who fed him, invited him into their homes, clothed him, and visited him, and those who didn't. Matthew records that Jesus says, "These righteous ones will reply, 'Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will say, 'I tell you the truth. When you did it to one of the least of these my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me.'" When we treat others with respect, we're being obedient to our Lord. When we treat others with disrespect, we're being disrespectful to our Lord. The way we treat other image bearers matters to God. Let us proceed with discerning how we can do so in a way that brings him honor.
Very likely, the first thought many people have when they hear that churches have been required to provide sexual harassment training by the state is that it's not a major issue for churches. However, the statistics on workplace harassment in churches is higher than it should be. A Pew Research study found that 6 out of 10 women have been sexually harassed at some point in their lives. That's a very substantial number. It's possible that the percentage is even higher, since some women don't feel comfortable reporting the harassment that they've experienced in a church. That same study found that 3 out of 10 men have been sexually harassed at some point in their lives. If these numbers seem surprising, consider incidents that you may have experienced or have heard about from others. Almost everyone has heard of an incident or even several instances of harassment in the church workplace.
I was a little more doubtful about the statistics on men, but then it occurred to me that I myself have actually experienced aggressive sexual behavior even while working for those Christian organizations. I can look back on 3 specific instances in which I was treated in a wrongful sexual way, and one of those was while I was working as a volunteer for a ministry while a very young man. I generally think that it is inevitable for anyone who works long enough that they are likely to see or experience some of the issues that we're discussing today. This shows why it's all that much more important that organizations be careful to be prepared for ways to prevent and to protect those who have experienced sexual harassment.
We all know that harassment harms the workplace because it harms the souls of people. Research has shown this. It's shown that harassment can cause absences, low productivity, low morale, and interpersonal conflicts. It hurts the whole work environment, not only the person being harassed. A study from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine found that the single most important factor in predicting sexual harassment is the organizational climate of the company. Consider the organizational climate of your own church. Is it generally a nurturing environment, or is it one where there is a far too casual attitude towards the subject matter of conversations that could be offensive, or interpersonal dynamics that could be viewed as oppressive at times? The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine study also found that companies that promote cultures of respect create a workplace that harassment is less likely to occur in the first place. And this is the type of environment that C4SO wants to create in all of its congregations. A culture of respect for individuals as image bearers of Christ. So as you think about the culture of your church, consider if there are any habits, activities, or other areas that come to mind as ones that could use improvement. Not all incidences of harassment are major points of conflict. There may be even a small part of your church's workplace culture that the Holy Spirit is bringing to mind right now that your church should choose to modify as you seek to apply the principles that we're covering today. Identifying the places of problems in the church can be difficult. If you're in a position of influence or authority in your church, I encourage you to prayerfully consider in the coming days ways to identify and change the obstacles to healthy relationships in your church that could reduce the opportunities for harassment to take place.
So let's get into the details. We're going to cover what sexual harassment is, including unacceptable forms of behaviors that may not rise to the level of unlawful behavior, examples of how it may occur, how to report it, remedies for victims, and a summary of employer responsibilities. We'll spend most of our remaining time together on the first 2 topics, which raise the most complex part of this training. We are going to begin by looking at the definition of sexual harassment at the federal level. Keep in mind that each state has its own definition, and they differ from each other in minor details. As part of this training program, you've been provided with a handout that gives more specific information about the definition of sexual harassment in your state. If you have not received a copy yet, feel free to contact the Diocesan Ombudsman for a copy. In order to have common ground among the churches in the various states that make up C4SO, we're going to look at a more general definition from a federal agency. Let's look at how the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, often referred to by its acronym, the EEOC, defines sexual harassment. It states, it is unlawful to harass a person, an applicant or employee, because of that person's sex. Harassment can include sexual harassment or unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. When this conduct explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment, it is sexual harassment. Now, there's a lot of information in here regarding what kinds of activities constitute harassment and the categories of individuals who are considered workplace harassers. Notably, sexual harassment in the workplace can be committed by people other than just employees. State laws vary on who is considered a workplace violator under their statutes. We want to consider the broadest definition in this training in order to be the most charitable to those who come in contact with our churches. The broadest definition covers the following: employees, applicants for jobs, even if they did not get the job, volunteers, paid or unpaid interns, independent contractors, and vendors. This last category of vendors includes those who may not have any relationship with the church at all other than providing goods and services for the church. This could include caterers, janitorial services, delivery services, repair services, and any others who come in contact with church employees and volunteers, and whom the church could reasonably know are harassing those under the church's care. As you can see, many who are considered to be agents of the church in possible workplace violations include some who are difficult for the church to control. Even so, however, church employees should be observant of all who do work for and on behalf of the church, and should seek to identify potential problem creators and take action to reduce the risk of workplace harassment.
It's easy to visualize the narrowest view of what constitutes harassment, such as an overbearing man who makes highly suggestive comments to women in the workplace. But as you've just seen from the EEOC definition, harassment is defined much more broadly than that. It can occur in a variety of circumstances. A victim and the harasser can be either a man or a woman. Sexual harassment is not only perpetrated by men. And again, not all victims are women. It's important to remember that either gender can be the victim or the aggressor. Additionally, it's a common misconception that sexual harassment only involves oppressing someone of the opposite sex. This too is inaccurate. The victim does not have to be of the opposite sex. The harasser can be the victim's supervisor, an agent of the employer, a supervisor in another area, a coworker, or a non-employee. The non-employee relates back to what Myron just spoke about regarding a vendor being a harasser. Further, the victims of a harassment incident are not limited to a specific person being harassed, but could be anyone affected by the offensive conduct. For example, a coworker who sees someone being harassed and is troubled by what they witness, they can be a victim as well. Sexual harassment may occur without economic injury to or discharge of the victim. When we hear the word unlawful, sometimes we may be tempted to only think of actions that end in someone being harmed economically or discharged, but as you've already begun to learn, it can be actions that have no economic injury or change to the victim's employment. Sexual harassment can happen outside of the workplace, such as at a work party, traveling for work, even on social media. In fact, many incidences of employment-related harassment take place when employees are away from the workplace. Harassment does not necessarily need to involve sexual activity, physical contact, or sexual suggestions. Any behavior that is oppressive can be construed as harassment as well. Rude or bullying behavior also constitute workplace harassment. In fact, if the behavior is offensive enough, it can give rise to civil liability for the church. In some states, bullying behavior can be considered actionable if done towards a protected class of individuals. Eliminating rude or bullying behaviors helps create an environment of respect for others, and thus creating a workplace where actionable harassment is less likely to occur. Bullying can be considered unlawful, again, if it's bullying based on a protected class. So while states vary in what classes they consider to be protected for harassment purposes, the most common categories include race and color, and that can include things such as hair texture and style, ancestry, national origin, religion, creed, age, disability, mental or physical, sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, medical condition, genetic information, marital status, and last, military or veteran status. And we'll get to some examples of those in a few minutes. But note that there are three of the categories here are sex and gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity and expression. Those are particularly challenging issues for the church. Many states do consider these categories to be a fully protected class, protected as any of the other classes. Yet undeniably, churches generally treat these categories differently. Handling this issue in a manner that prevents harassment requires thoughtfulness and care.
Examples of rude behavior are not greeting people who say hello, intentionally excluding someone from normal workplace conversations and making them feel unwelcome, failing to say thank you, interrupting co-workers, responding with frequent sarcasm or anger to normal interactions. Some of these may surprise some listeners, as those are not rare in the workplace. I suspect that each of us has experienced these and probably have acted in these ways as well. Even so, state guidelines have identified these as potential areas of harm that can be avoided with proper training and a commitment to creating a welcoming environment rather than a hostile one. Remember that rude behaviors will not generally rise to the level of harassment, but they do begin to create a work environment that could quickly lead to unlawful harassment. Examples of bullying behavior are yelling at coworkers, making threats to dismiss, demote, or give a bad review, spreading false information or rumors, attempts to destroy self-esteem or the confidence of others. Behavior meant to undermine, patronize, humiliate, intimidate, or demean. We'll get into some examples of these in a few minutes. Examples of unlawful behavior, that is, behaviors that the regulations of some states dictate are actionable and which generally intensify claims of bullying and rude behavior, include unwelcome sexual advances or invitations, unnecessary or unwanted touching, such as groping, massaging, or pinching, blocking normal movement, or physically interfering with the work of another individual. Threats or demands that a person submit to sexual requests as a condition of continued employment or to avoid some other loss, and offers of employment, related benefits, or in return for sexual favors. Displaying or sharing offensive images such as posters, videos, photos, cartoons, screensavers, emails, drawings, or social media sites that are derogatory or sexual. Offensive comments about appearance or other personal or physical characteristics such as sexually charged comments or comments on someone's physical disability. We've now discussed the general categories of behaviors that must be avoided in the workplace. These have included sexual harassment, generalized harassment, including bullying and rudeness. And we want to go a little deeper now into two specific and more complex parts of these categories before we move on. One is quid pro quo negotiation, and the other is a hostile work environment. Quid pro quo is a type of sexual harassment. It's a Latin term for something, that is suggesting that you do something for me and I'll do something for you. When someone demands sexual favors in exchange for employment benefits, or when someone demands sexual favors by threatening negative employment actions, they have committed a quid pro quo offense. This means that a manager or supervisor may not tell an employee that in order to receive a promotion, raise, preferred assignment, or other type of job benefit, or to avoid something negative like discipline or an unpleasant assignment, the employee must do something in return. What might this look like in a church? Consider an example of Melissa, a former youth group attendee who is now in college but home for the summer. She works at the church as an unpaid intern. She hopes to be hired at the church someday in the future. An elder in the church, who is a widower, told her that he could help her get a job, but that she would have a better chance if he could get to know her better on a date. She doesn't want to go on a date with him, and the comments made her uncomfortable. But she really wanted to work at the church, so she went on a date with him anyway. This is an example of the type of quid pro quo harassment where a person with power conditions a job, promotion, or other work benefit on the person's submission to sexual advances or other conduct based on sex.
The other type of sexual harassment we want to address in more detail is the creation of a hostile work environment. Someone who works in an office where they conclude, the air at work is full of sexual references and it's impacting me. They are experiencing a hostile work environment. A hostile work environment occurs when there is unwelcome behavior that is related to a legally protected characteristic, that is pervasive or severe, and unreasonably interferes with an individual's ability to do their job. A person doesn't have to tell their coworker that their behavior is inappropriate for a hostile work environment to be present. It's up to each individual to make sure their behavior is appropriate and not making others uncomfortable. Usually, it would take a pattern of behavior to reach the level of a hostile work environment. However, if behavior is severe, one comment alone can create a hostile work environment. Hostile work environments can be, first, directed at a specific employee. For example, a receptionist is subjected to regular requests for a date and crude jokes from a delivery driver. This is, again, another example of how a vendor could create liability for the church. Second, a hostile work environment can be directed at others. A teammate discusses sexual activities and is very demeaning to women at every staff meeting. This teammate has created a hostile work environment for all members of the team and anyone witnessing the staff meeting. One other type is widespread sexual favoritism. For example, a boss, John, regularly flirts with the women in the office. John has only promoted and given bonuses to the women that he's dated on his team in the last 5 years. John does not consider work experience or ability to work on a team when promoting employees on his team. This constitutes a hostile work environment. So what might this look like at a church? Suppose a female minister is on staff that is mostly made up of men. Sometimes at meetings, some of the men remark, "Oh, Susan's here, but we know she likes to stay quiet around the men. She likes to let the men be in charge." They regularly shut Susan down when she starts to share her opinion. If she does share her opinion, she's told that it's better that she let the men decide. These comments from her coworkers are unwanted and related to her being a woman, which is a protected class, and they're ongoing. This is sexual harassment. When you hear these stories, of course, they don't have to be verbatim, but try to think of times that you may have heard similar comments and think about how you might address someone if you heard comments like these in the future. Another hypothetical example is Megan. She's the only woman on a worship team at church. She hears the men on the worship team discussing the ladies of the congregation regularly. They rank their physical appearance based on their outfits that they've worn to church. They encourage Megan to wear tighter clothes and higher heels if she wants to be rated highly. She feels uncomfortable about how the men are talking about the women in their church. This is generally considered to be a hostile work environment. The offensive comments do not have to be specifically directed to the employee to be considered sexual harassment. This is sexual harassment. And as we discussed earlier, this isn't only an issue of men acting in a hostile manner towards women. Here's an example of how a man may experience a hostile work environment at a church. So a new male employee, Bob, has what others perceive to be more feminine qualities. So the church secretary begins making jokes about how Bob would never wear the pants in his family. This could continue and become harassment if it's ongoing and severe. Keep in mind that even one deeply offensive comment may be sufficient to constitute a hostile workplace. I'd like to give you another example of a possible type of hostile work environment to which churches may be vulnerable because of a commitment to acknowledging that God did create male and females differently. So Tony is a volunteer in the children's ministry. The female volunteers and even some of the parents dropping their children off for services keep making comments to Tony like, "Oh, I'm surprised you volunteer here. This job is for women." Or, "Men are not usually nurturing of children." Tony tries to laugh these comments off, but they make him uncomfortable. The children's director who interviewed him for the position knows that Tony thinks these comments are inappropriate and that they're bothering him, but she hasn't taken any action to stop them. Would this be considered unlawful harassment? Possibly, because he is being subjected to stereotypes about sex, such as stereotypes about what types of jobs men should have and what types of jobs women should have. That can be unlawful if the offensive conduct becomes a condition of employment or is severe or pervasive enough to create a work environment that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So as you can see, this is another example where those who are not employed by the church can still create a hostile work environment when their congregants are making their employees feel uncomfortable and the church is aware of it and takes no corrective actions. This example is on the fringe because it may be true that women generally volunteer in children's ministry and are more nurturing. However, if the comments are frequent and it's something the church can take action against, it may be required.
Unwelcome conduct is another category of behaviors that we want to emphasize in this training. We have a lengthy list that covers behaviors identified in several states as wrongful. Some of these are very obviously wrong, but surprisingly, many of these were very common in the workplace just a few years ago, and the recipients of these behaviors were generally expected to bear them in silence. In an era where there is much more sensitivity to creating a welcome work environment, reviewing a list like this can be helpful in identifying activities that can be found in many workplaces, but which should come to an end. One of the greatest values of a training program like this one is to remind the entire community of standards of care in the workplace that are shared and understood in a way that makes it less likely that anyone would be tempted to engage in these activities. These include referring to another as a girl, hunk, doll, babe, honey, tootsie, etc., kissing sounds, howling and smacking lips, pressure for sexual favors to go out on a date, sexual looks or gestures or whistling at someone, sending letters, telephone calls, emails, texts, or other material of a sexual nature, sexual teasing, jokes, remarks, or questions, turning work discussions to sexual topics, asking about sexual fantasies, preferences, or history, sexual comments, sexual innuendos, or sexual stories, sexual comments about a person's clothing, body, or looks, telling lies or spreading rumors about a person's sex life, massaging neck and shoulders, touching another employee such as their clothing, hair, or body, deliberate touching, leaning over, or cornering another person, actual or attempted rape or sexual assault. What might this look like at your church? One example could be the youth pastor who begins talking to one of the senior girls about her troubles with her friends. He finds her attractive and uses her dilemma to request that they pray together in a secluded room. He uses the opportunity to touch and rub her back as he prays for her. This makes the teenager very uncomfortable. This is sexual harassment. Or it could look like a single male pastor at your church who is a bodybuilder in his spare time. Some of the female employees talk openly about his great biceps. One of them walks up to him and asks him to flex for her. This makes the pastor feel uncomfortable. This also is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment does not have to be based on sexual desire to be considered sexual harassment. The EEOC has a chart of risk factors that make a work environment more susceptible to sexual harassment. They are as follows: a homogeneous workforce, workplaces where some employees do not conform to workplace norms, cultural and language differences in the workplace, coarsened social discourse outside the workplace, young workforces, workforces with high-value employees, workplaces with significant power disparities, workplaces that rely on customer service or client satisfaction, monotonous or low-intensity workplaces, isolated workplaces, workplaces that tolerate or encourage alcohol consumption, and decentralized workplaces. How might some of these show up in church environments? Well, let's take a look at a homogeneous workforce. In some ministries, a young workforce, workplaces with high-value employees, think about pastors who can attain a celebrity-like status. Workplaces with significant power disparities. Churches are definitely known for some positions being much more powerful. Take the lead pastor versus the secretary or janitor as examples. Isolated workplaces could include missionaries away overseas. Decentralized workplaces. This can be more like with any job in the days of the COVID era. Now that we've covered what sexual harassment is, we will discuss what happens if you experience it or see it happening. First, you have the right to tell the person to stop. The initiating and participating persons must stop the unwelcome behavior upon request. If the aggressor continues the behavior or retaliates against you because you ask them to stop, they can be found to have violated the law by engaging in sexual harassment or retaliation. Additionally, you have the right to report the sexual harassment. Several reporting options are available, and they vary state by state. The option you choose may depend on the nature and severity of the unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. Persons who report sexual harassment or participate in investigations are protected by law from retaliation. See your worksheet to see the appropriate way for you to report harassment in your state. Victims can seek remedies through various avenues. A victim can seek legal advice for their situation. It's most common for victims to utilize a civil action. Remedies can include back pay, lost benefits, clearing of a personal file, damages, hiring, promotion, reinstatement, front pay where reimbursement is not possible, and attorney's fees and costs. Some states have their own investigating agency to handle these types of claims. See your handout for your state's reporting options. It can be hard to report harassment, but please be assured that C4SO is committed to the eradication of harassment in the workplace. If you experience harassment, please report it right away. Report any violations by submitting a reporting form to the Ombudsman of the diocese. And there should always be kept in mind that even an ombudsman can be the source of some problems, and if ever the ombudsman is the harasser, then it should report it to the bishop.
Last, we're going to cover the employer's responsibility. Employers can be held responsible for sexual harassment depending on the situation. In some states, such as Illinois, employers are strictly liable for sexual harassment perpetrated by its members of management, regardless of whether the employer even knew of the harassment. Additionally, in most states, employers are liable for sexual harassment perpetrated by an employee or non-employee, such as a vendor, only if the employer knew or reasonably should have known of the harassment and failed to take the corrective action. If you have questions about your specific state as it relates to the employer's responsibility, please contact the Ombudsman and they will make sure to give you the information. Supervisors must take action if they see or know of harassment. Follow the protocols that your church has in place, and if you're not sure what they are, again, reach out to the Ombudsman of the diocese for addressing harassment, and they'll assist you with getting this information. Employers should do their best to prevent incidences of sexual harassment in the workplace by being vigilant and creating open dialogue. If it's reported or seen, it must be investigated. And if it's found to be happening, it must be corrected. It's also very important to remember that employers must not retaliate against someone for reporting harassment. A person must be able to report harassment without fear of retaliation because of the culture that the church has created. So let's move on to some best practices. Some of the best practices for prevention. First, churches of the diocese must adopt the C4SO policies against sexual harassment. Also, churches must make sure that all managers, employees, volunteers, and interns take the training annually. You should ensure that clear communication on how to report incidences of sexual harassment or conduct of a sexual nature. Managers and supervisors should monitor the work environment to ensure the workplace is free of sexual harassment. Supervisors should be aware of the conduct within their supervision. And managers and supervisors must lead by example and model appropriate conduct. All should refrain from engaging in conduct of a sexual nature. Managers and supervisors should conduct a sexual harassment climate check throughout the year. This can be done by discussing the topic at a team meeting or staff meeting or an in-service days. So what steps should you take if you need to investigate a complaint? First, you should report any complaint or known violation to the Ombudsman. This will be your first point of contact. Once you've reported the violation, you may be asked to do the following by the Ombudsman. Interview the complainant, the victim, and take reasonable action to protect the victim from retaliation or experiencing further sexual harassment during the investigation. Interview all relevant witnesses. Interview the alleged perpetrator of the sexual harassment. Document the investigation results and maintain the file as an employment record. Take corrective action as appropriate. Let's consider ways that the church can correct incidences of sexual harassment. What are some of the ways that the church may correct incidences of harassment? The Ombudsman will help guide and direct you regarding best options. You will not be alone through this process. So by taking appropriate corrective disciplinary action is one way to correct it. That can be up to and including termination of employment where organizational policy has been violated. In situations where the conduct in question did not rise to the level of sexual harassment or violation of policy, but nonetheless it's concerning behavior, consider counseling, training, and closer supervision of the employee. Take reasonable action within the organization to reduce the likelihood of future sexual harassment. This can be done by updating policies and communicating them to the workforce, providing supplemental or tailored sexual harassment training, or restructuring the working environment or reporting relationships. Follow up with the victim at regular intervals to ensure that they and the workplace remain free from sexual harassment.
So let's review what we've covered here today. There's a lot of information that we've gone over in this hour. Let's take a look at some of the high points again. First, harassment is more common than we think. We all have a part to play to ensure it doesn't happen here. Rude and bullying behavior can lead to unlawful harassment. Unlawful harassment can consist of a hostile work environment, quid pro quo, and other forms of sexual harassment. Harassment should be reported right away. Thank you all for your investment in creating a workplace of respect. It is even more important that the church set an example than what the world does because of our mandate as a church in being the salt and light of the world. We want the watching world to see the difference Christ makes in our lives by watching how we treat each other with love and respect in our community.
In conclusion of this training, you will have access to a quiz to complete and get credit for this training. Once that quiz is completed and passed with a 70% score or above, a certificate will be provided for you. And the non-supervisory employees, you will have completed your C4SO training for the year. If you're in a supervisory role, please ensure that you have completed the extra hour of training if your state requires it of you. If you have questions on the content of this training, please reach out by email to training@churchlawcenter.com. That's training, TRAINING, at churchlawcenter.com, and that's CHURCHLAWCENTER.com. If you have questions regarding specific incidences of sexual harassment at your church, please contact the Ombudsman, which is currently Kimberly Filer, at kimberly@c4so.org. That is KIMBERLEY at c4so.org.